Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. Meet Holden Thorp. He's the editor-in-chief of the Science family of journals, the position at the head of one of the most esteemed science publication empires holds real power, making Thorp a gatekeeper of what can and cannot be said about things like COVID, about what theories and narratives are pushed and which ones are suppressed and destroyed. And so Holden Thorp, a man few people have ever heard of, became one of the most important behind-the-scenes figures in how both the science and the politics of COVID played out. We already knew from the direction his journals took that Thorp was an establishment mouthpiece, for instance being the first outlet to aggressively push the natural origin narrative for COVID, even before most people had ever heard of the disease in January of 2020. But now we also have his emails, and they are really something. The obsequiousness and sycophancy Thorp, as a supposed guardian of scientific honesty, displayed as he pushed Anthony Fauci's fraudulent agenda is absolutely breathtaking. You may remember Science magazine as the outlet that was the first to publish an article on the origin of COVID. That was on January 31st, 2020, before most people had even heard of COVID. The author of that article, John Cohen, took pains to ensure that blame for the pandemic was with the Wuhan seafood market. He mentioned the word market 11 times. The article was sent to Anthony Fauci, with Science magazine probably expecting a pat on the back. But as it turned out, there was a link within a link contained in the article that, if someone made the effort to explore it, would have led eventually to another article that connected the Wuhan Institute of Virology to Fauci. That was a big problem for Fauci, and so he set in motion his next day secret teleconference whose purpose it was to cover up the true origin of the pandemic. The fact that this teleconference had taken place was then covered up by, you guessed it, Science magazine. Maybe they felt bad about the indirect link in their article that connected Fauci to the Wuhan lab, but more on that in a moment. That's because we first have to talk about Thorp, who, as editor-in-chief of the family of journals published under the Science banner, had enormous power to shape the COVID narrative. And that is exactly what he did when he wrote two editorials early in the pandemic. In the first one, he chastised Mike Pence for being a total rube, and then he blamed Trump for being some kind of anti-science nut. It's hard to believe that such extreme political vitriol should have come from the editor-in-chief of one of the most prestigious science publications. But it did. And then it got worse. Shortly afterwards, Thorp wrote a second editorial in which he boldly claimed that the genetic sequence of SARS-2 ruled out a lab-engineered virus. That was as bold as it was untrue, a bold-faced lie. Nothing in the genetic sequence can rule out a lab-made virus, and he knew it. In fact, as we covered on previous shows, the COVID virus has a distinctive genetic anomaly which other viruses of its class do not have, the infamous furin cleavage site. COVID also has very distinctive cutting sites within its genetic sequence. Those are sites where bits and pieces of genetic information can be cut out, swapped, and glued back in. Again, that is the opposite of ruling out genetic engineering. It's clear evidence of it. Yet Thorp put out his editorial regardless, and thereby helped to entrench the notion of a natural origin early on. A few months later, one of Thorp's staff, John Cohen, whom we already mentioned as the author of the infamous January 2020 natural origin puff piece, well, he was sent a whistleblower email that made at least two astonishing claims. Claims that if Science magazine was a proper, well, Science magazine, would have set off huge alarm bells and journalistic investigations. Instead, the whistleblower email set off another giant cover-up. What was it that the whistleblower said? Well, first of all, he or she told Science magazine about Fauci's secret teleconference. Remember, this was at a time that we did not know about the teleconference. It was a full year before the public found out about it via Freedom of Information lawsuits. Science could have completely changed the course of the discussion had they revealed that Fauci had organized a secret teleconference on COVID's origin long before most people had even heard of COVID. The second thing which the whistleblower revealed was almost equally as stunning. It was the fact that Proximal Origin, which is the infamous paper ghostwritten by Fauci in February 2020 to push the fraudulent natural origin narrative, well, Proximal Origin had been rejected by Nature magazine for publication. And that means that the paper was rubbish, which it was. But we were never told of the rejection, and so instead Proximal Origin went on to become one of the most cited papers of all time, notwithstanding that it was total garbage. How did that garbage end up being published anyway? Well, as the whistleblower told Science magazine, after the paper was rejected by Nature magazine, it somehow found its way into Nature Medicine, which always seemed like an odd place for it given that it's not about medicine. We have since found out from other emails that it was Fauci's partner in pushing the cover-up, the World Health Organization's chief scientist, Jeremy Farah, who helped Fauci's gang to get their fraudulent paper published. So what did Science magazine do with the explosive whistleblower information about the COVID origin cover-up being orchestrated by Fauci? You guessed it, they made sure the whistleblower information was given to Fauci. You can't make this stuff up. Meanwhile, the public and other members of the science community, the people who Science magazine is meant to inform, were deliberately kept in the dark. But that was not the end of Science magazine's and its editor-in-chief's efforts to run interference for Fauci and his natural origin fraudsters. When two scientists, Norwegian Birger Sorensen and Scotsman Angus Dalgleish, wrote an early paper outlining why COVID must have come out of a lab, Thorp outright rejected their paper, claiming that he couldn't publish something that was critical of Proximal Origin in any of his journals, allegedly because Proximal Origin was published elsewhere. Of course, that excuse was total nonsense. The lab leak paper wasn't a critique of Proximal Origin, it was a lab leak paper which, like every other paper ever published in the history of science, cited and referred to other articles. Thorp wasn't playing the role of a science editor, he was playing the role of a science gatekeeper, and now we finally have a clearer insight into what was going on behind the scenes.